Some legends don't roar, they return quietly, just when the world forgets they were real. Harrison Ford hadn't touched the controls of that old floatplane in years. But when a canyon burned and every modern option failed, someone whispered his name, and that was enough. Enough to wake a memory. Enough to make the sky listen one more time. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The fire started with a single strike, one crack of lightning against a brittle ridge of pine trees on the north face of an Idaho canyon. The kind of place that doesn't show up on maps unless you know where to look. By the time the first smoke report came in, the fire had already jumped the ravine, devouring dry brush and old timber like it had been waiting all summer to ignite. Within an hour, it became a wall of flame curling through the canyon, closing in from all sides. A group of campers, 2 families, 4 adults, 3 kids, and an elderly grandfather were caught in the middle. They had pitched tents near the river bend, thinking they'd be safe under the trees. But now those same trees were turning into spears of heat, sending embers into the sky. From the Emergency Coordination Center 10 miles out, a rescue chopper was scrambled. The pilot was experienced, the crew ready, but as they approached the mouth of the canyon, a downdraft hit, hard. The kind that slaps a helicopter like a paper toy and reminds you just how small man-made things are. They tried again, higher this time, but the crosswinds curled violently off the cliff walls. After the third attempt, the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "We can't hold her, we're pulling out." The words landed like gravel in a silent room. Ground teams studied topo maps and fire spread projections, but it was useless. Every viable road was blocked, every alternate route scorched or still burning. The canyon had become a bowl of fire with no handles. One FEMA agent, young, red-eyed, fingers shaking over his keyboard, stood up and whispered what no one wanted to say. "We are going to have to watch them burn." Then came the voice. It didn't rise above the noise. It cut through it, calm, weathered, matter of fact. "No," the voice said. "I landed there, 1986, husky with floats. She can still do it." Heads turned, radios lowered. Someone near the operations map blinked and looked across the room. Sitting quietly in the far corner was a man. He wore an old jacket that looked military-issue 2 lifetimes ago, his cap pulled low. A mug of black coffee in his hands. No one had noticed him before. No one had reason to, until now. At first, no one moved. The voice had landed in the center of the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples hadn't finished reaching the edges. A few heads turned, more out of reflex than belief. The man in the corner didn't look like anything special. Just an old guy in a faded bomber jacket, collar frayed, coffee mug chipped at the rim. His cap shaded most of his face, but the way he held the cup, steady, 2 fingers on the handle, there was something precise about it, something still. One of the incident commanders squinted, then looked at the logistics chief beside him. "Who the hell is that?" he asked. The logistics chief shrugged. "I don't know, thought he was a retired forest ranger or something. He's been here since this morning, didn't say a word until now." A heavyset crewman laughed under his breath. "He says he landed in that canyon, in a husky. What's next? He gonna tell us he flew through a volcano in '85. The room chuckled, but only halfway, because the old man didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't explain. He just stared at the map on the wall, the one that showed the canyon like a black hole surrounded by red. Then he stood, slowly, and now the room started to shift. The younger staffer at the comms desk tilted his head. Something tugged at him. A name, a story, something half-remembered from his uncle in Montana. The uncle who used to fly gliders and hang around at backcountry airfields. The uncle who once said, over a campfire, that the only reason he believed in God was because he saw a beaver seaplane land sideways on the Snake River with a broken engine and 3 hikers inside. Piloted by someone who wasn't just a movie star kid, he was the real thing. The young man blinked hard, then searched the emergency volunteer registry. It took less than a minute. Name, Ford Harrison, certifications, fixed-wing. Rotorcraft, floatplane, multi-engine, experience, over 5,000 flight hours, former mountain rescue pilot, affiliation, Civil Air Patrol inactive, occupation, listed as retired. He looked up, then back at the old man, who was now walking toward the main map table. Quiet, deliberate, no rush. The room didn't laugh anymore. Someone near the door whispered, "Wait, is that?" Another voice cut in, "That's Indiana Jones, right?" A third corrected them, this time with certainty. "No, that's Harrison Ford, the one who really flies." Ford reached the map and placed 2 fingers on a specific contour line, tracing it down through the canyon like someone reading a scar. Then he spoke again, same calm tone. "Right here, a bend in the river. If the fire hasn't boiled it dry, I can put the floats down, but only once." The silence that followed wasn't fearful. It wasn't disbelief. It was something rarer, recognition. Because when all the tech fails, when wind defeats rotors and fire eats strategy, sometimes the only thing left is someone who remembers how to land where no one else dares to try. And right now, the man in the faded jacket was the only one in the room who didn't seem afraid of the sky. The old hangar sat at the edge of the field, more rust than metal, more memory than function. Weeds curled through the fence line, and the wind pushed against the sagging roof as if trying to remind the place it was forgotten. But Harrison Ford walked like he'd been here yesterday, not with nostalgia, with purpose. The group followed him out in cautious silence, a few trying to catch up, others hanging back, as if unsure whether what they were seeing was real. The air smelled of dust and oil. Time had soaked into every beam and rivet. Ford reached the main doors, found the latch by feel, and slid them open with a groan of old steel. Inside, beneath a weather-stained tarp, sat the plane. A DHC-2 Beaver, float-equipped. Aluminium skin dulled by years, a crack spidering across the right windshield, one wingtip slightly bowed from age or weather or both. But it didn't sag, it waited. He stepped forward and pulled back the tarp in one motion. The dust lifted, not in a cloud, but in a kind of hush, like the air itself remembered. The floats were scuffed, the prop worn, but the bones were straight. The Beaver didn't need to be pretty, it needed to fly. Ford walked the perimeter, hands sliding over panels, checking seams, feeling the give in the struts. He tapped the fuel gauge, still sealed, opened the cowling, engine intact. One of the younger FEMA crew said under his breath, "This thing can't be airworthy." But Ford didn't argue. He opened the door, climbed in, and sat down like it was still 1986. Inside the cockpit, the smell hit first, oil, leather, sun-dried metal. He ran his fingers along the yoke, tapped the altimeter, flipped one toggle just to hear the click. Then he paused, looked to the right. The young technician from earlier had followed him up the float step, peered inside, and saw it. Just beside the throttle quadrant, faint but unmistakable, were 2 letters carved into the panel. HF, not fresh, not flashy, just there. Like initials in a tree, left not for others, but as a reminder to the one who'd put them there. He whispered, "You flew this." Ford didn't look at him, just adjusted a vent lever and said, "She still remembers." Down on the ground, an older man in coveralls stepped forward, squinting into the light. "That's the same Beaver from the Snake River rescue. I'd bet my tools on it. You dropped her on a gravel bar in '89. Landed with one flap and a prayer." Ford finally spoke up, eyes still on the dash. It wasn't a prayer, just the right angle. The radio on someone's hip crackled. Update from the aerial unit. Wind shear had intensified. The rescue chopper had turned back. Again, the canyon was now officially unreachable by conventional air. All eyes turned back to the seaplane. It didn't roar, it didn't glow. But in that moment, standing silent in its hangar, with dust rising and initials carved in metal, it felt more alive than anything else on the ground. No one said it out loud, but they all saw it the same way. The modern tools had failed, the sky had turned on them, and now the only way in was through this relic and the man who never stopped trusting it. The flight suit was older than some of the crew members watching him zip it up. Olive green, faded at the seams, elbows patched with canvas from another decade. Harrison Ford rolled up one sleeve and checked the watch on his wrist. No screens, no GPS. Just an analog dial, scratched crystal, leather band worn thin by time. He nodded once, then stepped out onto the dock. The Beaver had been fueled, checked, double-checked. No one asked him for a flight plan. There wasn't time. And even if there had been, he wouldn't have written one. Ford didn't fly by the book. He flew by feel, by memory, by lines in the wind most people didn't know how to read. The float slid into the river, carving two dark grooves through the reflection of the fire above. Smoke hung low, drifting like ghosts across the water. The sun, if it was still there, had turned red behind the clouds of ash. He throttled up. The propeller spat mist and grit into the air. The Beaver surged forward. Wheels screeched on gravel as the ground crew backed away. Water split into a fan as the floats built speed. Faster, louder. The plane shuddered once, then twice, fighting the weight of air thick with heat. Then lift. The Beaver broke from the water like a fish through glass. Clean, sudden, beautiful in its defiance. Spray caught the sun and burned gold for half a second before disappearing into the smoke. Inside the command trailer, no one spoke. The radar blip moved slow but steady. The technician with the headset whispered, "He's airborne." Someone else muttered, "Impossible." And then, from the far side of the room, a voice they didn't expect. "Not for him," said the retired brigadier general, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. "Last time I saw a liftoff like that, it was in a war zone outside Kabul. The pilot used a ravine like a slingshot. Same style, same plane, same man." In the sky, Ford adjusted his grip on the yoke. The wind hit from the left, sharp, twisting. The plane lurched, wing dipped. No panic. He trimmed slightly, nudged the rudder, brought the Beaver back online like he was calming a skittish horse. Another gust. Stronger. The nose veered, tail kicked. He leaned in, spoke under his breath. Not a curse. A conversation. The smoke closed in. Visibility dropped to yards. But he didn't need eyes. He knew the terrain like a scar, the cliffs, the river bend. The air patterns that rose off hot stone. He wasn't navigating, he was returning. Back on the ground, a junior fire captain stared through binoculars. Nothing but haze. But he still whispered, almost like prayer, "He's not flying. He's talking to the sky." And the sky, it seemed, was answering. The canyon was no longer a place. It was a furnace. Heat shimmered off the stone walls like breath from a dragon's mouth. Smoke poured over the cliffs in thick, rolling sheets, wrapping the river below in a choking haze. What used to be water now steamed. The sun had vanished. Shadows meant nothing. Direction meant less. In the heart of that chaos, behind a half-melted boulder, a mother clutched her two children. Her voice was gone from shouting. Her husband held a wet cloth over his father's mouth, trying to filter the ash. The grandfather's eyes fluttered. The children were silent, the kind of silence that comes after the crying stops. Then came the sound, not a roar. Not the thunder of rotors or the whine of jets. This was something else. Lower, older, a vibration that felt like memory. The Beaver appeared through the smoke like a silver ghost, dropping hard and fast, nose angled downward, wings flexed. It didn't descend like a modern aircraft. It dove like something with a purpose. Ford kept the yoke steady, eyes locked on the narrow ribbon of river that twisted between burning banks. It was too short, too shallow, and too late to find anything better. There was no flare zone, no wind sock, just instinct and timing, the kind of math you only get to solve once. The water shimmered, distorted by heat. He pulled back slightly, felt the floats bite the air, then the surface. The first contact was rough, a skip, then a slap. The left float dipped. Hard, a rock beneath the current clipped the underside. The Beaver lurched, banked. Inside the canyon, the world tilted, but Ford didn't overcorrect. He didn't fight the roll. He leaned with it, shoulder pressing into the curve, hands easing the yoke instead of wrestling it. The right float caught clean, stabilized. The plane straightened, skipped again, and settled, a rush of spray, then stillness. Inside the command center, the radar showed nothing for a full 3 seconds, just static, then a blip, then a second one, stable, grounded. A woman near the communications board sat back, her headset slipping. She covered her mouth. "He made it," she whispered. "He actually made it." A man in the corner, the one who'd laughed earlier, just shook his head. "No way, no damn way." On the water, steam hissed against the metal hull. Ford sat still, hands still on the yoke. The canyon was screaming around him, but inside the cockpit there was silence. Not peace, just focus. He looked up through the cracked windshield, eyes scanning the orange glowing smoke. Then he said it, quiet, low, not to anyone, maybe not even out loud. Give me 15 minutes, just 15. He shut down the engine, pulled off one glove, reached behind the seat for the med kit and emergency blankets. The cargo compartment held a water pack, flare gun, and a small oxygen bottle. It wasn't much. It was enough. Outside, the river steamed. The fire crackled on both sides like it was waiting, but it didn't move forward. Not yet, almost like it was listening. Ford opened the side door and stepped out onto the float, one hand gripping the strut for balance. The heat hit him full in the chest, but he didn't flinch. He adjusted the collar of his suit and started walking across the float toward the rocky bank. Somewhere ahead, past the haze and the heat, were people who didn't know he'd come. But they would. He just needed 15 minutes. The air was thicker now. Smoke rolled across the canyon like liquid shadow, curling through the trees and creeping into the narrow bends of the river. Ford moved fast, not with panic, but with the quiet urgency of someone who knew time was no longer measured in minutes, but in breaths. He found them huddled against the far edge of a boulder, faces streaked with ash, lungs rasping with every inhale. The grandfather was conscious, but weak. The father's hands trembled as he held a water bottle to his wife's lips. The two kids stared at Ford with wide, terrified eyes, their small bodies locked in place by fear. He didn't speak right away. He knelt, checked pulses, assessed injuries. Then he met the father's gaze and simply said, "We're getting out of here, now." They moved fast, one child in his arms, the other guided by his hand. The father carried the grandfather. The mother staggered, held up by Ford's shoulder. He didn't flinch when she collapsed against him. He just adjusted and kept moving. Back to the floatplane, back through the haze, back toward the only way out. When they reached the Beaver, the smoke had thickened. The water was boiling in shallow spots. Ford helped them in, mother and child in the rear, father and grandfather strapped across from them. The smallest boy refused to let go of Ford's leg. He was shaking, tears streaking down a face already smudged gray. Ford crouched and looked him in the eyes. "Hey," he said gently, "you ever play airplane?" The boy didn't answer, just blinked through the tears. "I'm really good at it," Ford said, then smiled, just enough to register, just enough to be believed. The boy let go. Ford climbed into the cockpit, wincing slightly as his left shoulder brushed the yoke. He didn't mention the pain. No one needed to know, not now. The impact from the rock earlier had bruised more than metal. Something deep in the joint burned every time he pulled back, but he ignored it, secured his harness, brought the systems online. Engine coughed. Then caught. Outside, the wind had shifted again, blowing straight at the nose. The usual takeoff route was now suicide, not enough space, not enough lift, and certainly not with a full load. But Ford didn't curse, didn't debate. He looked up at the cliffs, measured the angles, watched the way smoke curled between the walls. There was a trick to it, a pocket, a slingshot if you hit it just right. He pushed the throttle. The floats groaned against the water. The Beaver strained, heavy, slow. Every instinct said abort, but Ford kept going. The river narrowed ahead. Smoke thickened. He adjusted the rudder, nudged the yoke, lined the plane with the narrowest seam between two canyon walls. At the last possible second, he pulled. The wind fought him. The engine roared. The Beaver shuddered, lifted, dropped again, then lifted harder. A gust caught the underside just as the wings tipped past the edge of a cliff wall. They were airborne. Inside the cabin, the mother cried out. The grandfather moaned. One of the kids screamed in terror. The little boy covered his face until Ford's voice came back, calm, almost amused. "See," he said over his shoulder, "told you I was good at this game." The boy looked up. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed, became something else, something closer to faith. Ford adjusted trim, cradled his left shoulder without drawing attention. The pain was sharp now, radiating into his chest. He kept flying. The canyon dropped behind them. The fire still burned, but it was below now, and they were climbing. They were flying home. The Beaver touched down just beyond the bend where the water ran wide and smooth. The float skipped once, then settled, sending out a ripple that broke the smoke's reflection. On the bank, rescue crews were already waiting. Radios buzzed, stretchers ready, cameras in hand, but no one moved until the plane rolled to a stop. Ford opened the hatch. No announcement, no salute, just motion. He climbed out, helped lower the mother into the arms of paramedics. Her breathing was shallow, eyes closed, skin still streaked with soot. "She needs water and oxygen," Ford said. That was all. No name, no title. The others followed, guided out by the father. The grandfather groaned as he was lifted. The children were last. One walked, dazed. The other, the small one who had clung to Ford's leg, stepped onto the dock and turned. He didn't say anything. Just looked at the plane, as if trying to understand how something so old could still fly. Reporters moved in. Microphones were raised. Someone shouted, "Who flew it?" Another called, "Is it true that was Harrison Ford?" But by the time they reached the water's edge, he was already walking away. No press conference, no photo, just footsteps on damp gravel, and then one voice. A little girl from a nearby rescue van, no older than 7, broke free from the group. She ran up to him, tugged at his sleeve. He stopped, looked down. "Excuse me," she said, breathless. "What's your name, so I can tell my teacher?" He crouched slowly and met her eyes. Then he took off one glove, brown leather, creased at the knuckles, stained with age, and placed it gently in her small hands. "You can tell her," he said, "he was the one who flew." Then he stood, turned, and kept walking. The girl stared at the glove like it was made of gold. She didn't call after him. She didn't need to. Minutes later, the cameras caught only empty water and smoke. The Beaver had been pushed to the far dock. Ford was gone. No one saw him leave. Not by boat, not by car. It was as if he'd never been there at all. But the glove remained. And so did the girl. And somewhere in her retelling of the day, when the class asked how she got that glove, when her teacher asked what his name was, she would say it exactly as he told her. The one who flew. The cabin sat quiet beneath the weight of Wyoming sky. Pines creaked in the breeze, snowmelt dripped from the edge of the roof, and the sun leaned low behind the ridgeline, turning the wooden walls gold. The Beaver was there, tucked beneath a weathered tarp out back, floats resting on a cradle of old timber. Still, waiting. Inside, Harrison Ford sat at the small table by the window, a mug cooling in his hand. The light had turned soft, the kind that makes a room feel like memory. On the table, a single envelope, no return address, no stamp, just a fold in the paper and handwriting that was too clean to be casual, too careful to be official. He opened it slowly, read it once, then again. "I was the boy you pulled from the Snake River in '92. My parents didn't make it, but I did. I'm now the lead pilot for Idaho Search and Rescue. Last week I flew 2 missions into that same canyon. We got everyone out. I used a Beaver, same build, same trim settings, same winds. I still remember how you flew it. Thank you. You saved more than one life that day." No signature. Just that, a quiet voice from the past stepping forward. Ford folded the letter and placed it inside the back of a leather logbook worn soft by time. He flipped through the pages, old flights, short notes, coordinates scribbled by flashlight. Then he picked up a pen and wrote, "July fire extraction, canyon approach successful, 4 lives saved, float damage minor, aircraft responsive, sky still listening." He set the pen down, closed the book. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, just enough to lift the corner of the tarp. A sliver of silver wing caught the light, as if the plane had taken a breath. Ford stood, stretched his shoulder, still stiff from the impact. He didn't wince, he didn't speak. Just stepped onto the porch, looked up at the evening sky, and let the silence wrap around him. There was no sound, no engine, no call sign, just wind and sky and the quiet rhythm of a man who no longer flew to be seen, but flew because sometimes the sky still calls your name. And somewhere high above the pines, a legend kept flying. Unseen, unheard, but never gone. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.